We started with the introduction, which was halach ma'anya, which actually was 3 different phrases, 3 different sentences. We saw in other earlier versions of the Haggadah that those sentences might have been jumbled or mixed and matched in different ways. We were sort of wondering, what is the bread of affliction? Is this something that we ate as slaves in Egypt, or is it the symbol of our freedom on the way out? Sort of a double symbolic food there. And then we talked about what it means to welcome people in, pour people into our meal, whether that's something that was a live invitation or whether that's something that we might prepare to do in advance, or whether that's just an invitation for the hungry people in our own house. And then the last line of halach ma'anya was sort of the arc of the story, right? Where this year we are here, next year in the land of Israel, this year we are slaves, next year we are free. Even though there was another version of the halach ma'anya that had, basically, now we are free, but in most of the versions that we have, it's now we are slaves, and next year we'll be free. And that arc of the story is what we're going to follow today. What does it mean to go from the place where we are downgraded to the place where we are redeemed, and what are those endpoints? That's what we're going to start exploring as we look at the Haggadah. What happens once the child asks, where we start to really tell the story. And what we're going to see in the Haggadah is today's text, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That is one possible telling of the story, but not the only possible telling of the story that we're going to have in the Haggadah. And the Haggadah is sort of going to tell and retell the points of the story from degradation to praise. And that's what we're going to see played out today. So today is sort of really the first attempt. If you exclude halach ma'anya, which was even like a introductory attempt, this is the first attempt to really tell the story of the Haggadah. Vayotzienu Adonai Eloheinu misham biyad chazaka u'bizroa netuya. That's how we read it in most Haggadot. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, but Hashem, our God, took us out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And indeed, the sort of the points of the beginning and the end of this story is often we think about Seder night, which is to say, and what Pesach is celebrating, which was we're slaves and God took us out. That's pretty much the beginning and the end. But as I'm saying, this is one version of the story. It's the first version that we're telling, but as we noted earlier this week, the center of the Haggadah is really probably the core and the original. So as we're sort of coming in from the beginning, this is one version of the story, but not the only one, and maybe not even the main one. So let's sort of explore what that means. So let's go back to the Mishnah. We looked at the Mishnah when we were trying to figure out with Manish Tana. So I'm just going to remind us where we started, and then we'll pick up at the bottom half of the Mishnah, which is taking us to our text today. Just to remind you, they pour him a second cup. And here the son asks his father, and if there's no knowledge with the son, his father teaches him, right? That's the plan A, plan B, and then it's Manish Tana. I didn't bring you the whole text again, but that's what we see in this Mishnah. After they list out the 3 questions, as it was in the Mishnah, then we get the following statement. Ulefi da'ato shel ben aviv milamdo. According to the knowledge or the ability, the intelligence of the child, should his father instruct him? Okay, so that's sort of like a pedagogy, comment. And then what is the instruction? Machil begenut u'misayem b'shevach. You start with genut, shame or disgrace, and finish with shevach, with praise. Okay, that's what one is being instructed in. The instruction is, the teaching is how we began in shame and ended in praise. And then the Mishnah adds a sentence, V'doresh me'arami oved avi ad she'yigmor kol ha'parasha kula. And one expounds a set of verses in Deuteronomy, which we're going to get to later on about what these verses are. My father was a wandering Aramean, or an Aramean tried to destroy my father, until he finishes that entire section. So just to note here, there is an interpretive possibility on the Mishnah where you might say Marchil Bigenut Umisayem B'Shevach is just the headline, and the explainer is, and how do you do that? How do you start from degradation and end in praise? Well, it has something to do with these verses in Deuteronomy about an Aramean trying to destroy my father, or my father was a wandering Aramean. That's a possibility of sort of unpacking Matchil B'Genut and Misayim B'Shevach, but you don't have to read it that way. They could be two separate instructions, and in some ways, that's how the Haggadah takes it. Step one, start with degradation and with praise. Step two, do the drasha, do the expounding of Arami Oved Avi. That's again how most Haggadot are dealing with this now. Is that it's not a headline and a sort of explanation. Rather, it's two instructions. Number one, start from degradation and then praise. Number two, do something with the set of verses in Deuteronomy and expound them. But those verses could be the journey from Genut to Shevach, and that's sort of one of the complexities of the Haggadah is how am I defining? You could really take these four words as the theme of the entire Haggadah, the Maggid section. What does it mean to start from degradation and end in praise? What are my end point, my beginning point, and my end point? So let's take a look at how the Talmud deals with this. Matchil b'genut u'misayim b'shevach. My beginut. What does it mean to start in degradation? So Rav says, Mitchila ovdei avodat kilulim hayu avatin. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. That's Rav's beginning point. And we're going to come back to that because that shows up in the Haggadah a little bit later. Rav's take on this question of what does it mean to start from degradation. But we have another opinion, which in most printed texts of the Gemara is Shmuel, who makes sense because he's normally the one who disagrees with Rav, but actually in all the old manuscripts, it's not Shmuel, it's Rava. And Josh Kalb sort of wrote an article about this. It points out Rava, who's a student a couple of generations later than Rav, disagrees with the previous teaching, which is much older, and says, no, the Genut, the degradation is Avadim Hayinu. Avadim Hayinu is a quote from Deuteronomy, from another part of Deuteronomy, and that is different from our ancestors were idol worshippers, rather we were slaves. That's the starting point for Rava, and we're going to explore that, and that sort of gives us our text that we're looking at today, Avadim Hayinu leFaro Mitzrayim. That's Rava's answer to the question of where do you start the story? Where does the degradation begin? It begins, according to Rava, as we were slaves in Egypt. And Rava himself, also on the next page of the Talmud, says, Sarich sheyomar ve'otanu hotzi misham. You also need to say, God took us out of there. And so what you have here with Rava is a beginning point and an end point. The beginning point is we were slaves, and the end point is God took us out, which is really just two verses in Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 21 and verse 23. So for Rava, the story is about from slavery to freedom. That is not the only interpretation. That is not Rav's interpretation. Rav starts us off as our ancestors were idol worshippers, and that's something we're going to explore as we look at that alternate telling of what it means to go from degradation to praise. Let's just take a look at the verses that Rava was quoting and see if we can even there identify different beginning and end points. So this is one of the verses talking about Pesach. Right, this is this text that we're going to see used in the four sons. So this is one of the questions that comes up from the child in the Torah, and you're going to respond and say, Abadim ayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim, vayotzienu Adonai miMitzrayim biyad chazaka. You can see that's exactly the text that we have in the Haggadah, although it's adding ubizro and ituya, and with an outstretched arm, which actually in some translations of the Bible, they add those words as well, like some ancient translations. And so that's where Rava is taking us as the beginning and the end. And again, the end might be Vayotzienu Adonai miMitzrayim biyad chazaka. God took us out with an outstretched arm. But you see that again in verse 23, after God does the plagues, V'otanu hotzi misham. V'otanu hotzi misham is just the beginning of the rest of the verse, which says, Liman havi otanu latet lanu et haaretz asher nishba lavotenu. Right? Maybe it's not just that God took us out of there, but God took us out of there in order to bring us to this land, to give us this land that God promised to our ancestors. So even in Rava's telling, where the beginning is we were slaves in Egypt, the end point is a little bit unclear. Is the end point God took us out, or is the end point God took us out and brought us to this land? which is a different endpoint than we left Egypt. We left Egypt to arrive here. As we're going to see, that possibility of ending up in a land, of ending up in a geography as the endpoint of what is the Shevach, what is the praise that the Mishnah is talking about, that's going to come over and over again in the Haggadah, even though we don't think of it that way, but that's where we started off with Halach Ma'anya. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. That's another way of saying we were slaves and then God took us out of Egypt to bring us to this land. So a lot of what we're going to be exploring in the Haggadah when we look at the different sections is, what does it mean to start from degradation and end in praise? What is the beginning and the end point of that story? And we're going to pick that up again next week. So we'll see you on Monday at 7:45. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom.